Imagine walking into your home, only to find the love of your life in bed with someone else. What do? Mark, a 32-year-old tech genius, finds himself in that exact nightmare when he catches his wife, Emma, in a compromising position with her ex. With emotions running high, a gun in hand, and no way out, the only question left is what happens when love turns into rage. Mark and Emma's love story began like a scene from a romantic movie. Mark, a 32-year-old software engineer, was the epitome of reliability and stability. He was the guy everyone could count on, a problem solver, a hard worker, and a man deeply devoted to his wife. Emma, 30, was his opposite in many ways. She was vibrant, ambitious, and charismatic, a marketing executive who thrived in the fast-paced world of big ideas and bold campaigns. Together, they seemed like a perfect match, balancing each other's strengths and weaknesses. Their marriage had been a journey of shared dreams and moments that felt timeless, dancing barefoot in the kitchen, late-night conversations about their future, and travels to places they'd never forget. But over time, the rhythm of life began to shift. Mark's career started to demand more of him, and long hours at the office turned into missed dinners and quiet nights where Emma would sit alone, wondering if she'd been left behind. Emma's world, meanwhile, became more vibrant and social. Her office was full of energy, and she was often the star at networking events. That's where Ethan re-entered the picture. Ethan, 34, was an architect she'd dated years ago, a charming, confident man who knew exactly how to command a room. At first, their conversations were harmless, catching up like old friends. But soon, they became something more. Mark, wrapped up in his work, never noticed the signs. Emma grew more distant, less present. She smiled less, and her laughter, once so frequent in their home, faded. Mark chalked it up to stress or fatigue, promising himself they'd fix things once he finished his next big project. He never suspected that his wife was slipping away, and that Ethan was filling the void he didn't even realize existed. Mark's Tuesday started like any other. Meetings, emails, deadlines, it was a typical grind. He'd been thinking about Emma all day, guilt tugging at him for how little time they'd spent together recently. He decided to surprise her with her favorite takeout and a small gift he picked up on the way home. It wasn't much, but he thought it might remind her how much she meant to him. As he walked into the house, he noticed how quiet it was. Normally, Emma would be in the living room with the TV on, or in the kitchen experimenting with a new recipe. Tonight, there was nothing, just silence. The uneasiness crept in slowly, like a faint shadow at the edge of his mind. Shrugging it off, he called out, "Emma, I'm home." No answer. He set the bags down and wandered through the house, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. As he neared the bedroom, something caught his attention, a sliver of light spilling out from the slightly ajar door. His heart rate quickened, and an inexplicable sense of dread settled in his chest. Slowly, he pushed the door open, and what he saw made his world come crashing down. Emma was in their bed, tangled in sheets with another man. Not just any man, Ethan. Mark stood frozen, unable to process the scene. His mind screamed at him to look away, to do something, but his body betrayed him. Emma's wide, horrified eyes met his, her face a mix of guilt and panic. Ethan, on the other hand, looked completely unbothered. In fact, he smirked. The weight of the betrayal hit Mark like a freight train. Everything, the late nights, the distance, the missed opportunities to reconnect, it all led to this. His wife, his partner, had chosen someone else. The shock quickly turned to rage as Mark stepped into the room, his voice trembling with fury. "What the hell is going on here?" Emma stammered, "Mark, I can explain." But there was no explanation that could undo what he'd just seen. Mark felt his world collapse, the life he'd built with Emma now shattered beyond recognition. Mark stood there, his heart pounding, fists clenched at his sides. The sight of Emma with Ethan burned into his memory, a betrayal so sharp it left him breathless. The air in the room was heavy, suffocating, as though time itself had stopped to acknowledge the enormity of what just unfolded. For a moment, he couldn't find the words. He simply stared at Emma, the woman he had devoted his life to, and at Ethan, who leaned back on the bed with an air of infuriating smugness. How long? Mark's voice was low, steady, but the pain behind it was unmistakable. His question cut through the silence like a knife. Emma's eyes darted from him to Ethan, her lip trembling. She sat up, clutching the sheet to her chest, as if it could shield her from the storm she'd unleashed. "Mark, please." "It's not what you think," she began, but the words sounded hollow even to her. "Not what I think," Mark snapped, his voice rising. "I think my wife is in our bed with him. So why don't you tell me what I'm missing?" Emma's tears spilled over, but Mark wasn't moved. Every word she'd ever spoken about love and commitment now felt like a lie. The woman he thought he knew, the life he thought he had, was unraveling right before his eyes. Ethan, lying there as though he were on a beach instead of in the middle of someone else's marriage, chuckled. "You were bound to find out eventually," Marky said, his tone dripping with arrogance. "Emma deserves more than what you gave her." Mark's gaze snapped to Ethan, his anger boiling over. "Shut your mouth," he hissed, his voice sharp enough to make even Ethan flinch. "You don't get to sit there and talk about what she deserves." Emma reached out as if to calm Mark, but he stepped back, his breath uneven. He couldn't even look at her anymore. The betrayal, the humiliation, it was too much. He felt like a fool, and every second in that room only added fuel to his rage. Mark's head spun with anger and grief. The betrayal was more than he could bear. His hands trembled as he tried to regain control of his emotions, but his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts: the years he'd invested in their marriage, the sacrifices he'd made, and now this, his wife and her lover in the sanctuary of their home. Ethan's smirk only made it worse. "What are you going to do, Mark? Yell at us? Kick me out?" His voice was taunting, laced with mockery. "Let's be honest, you were too blind to see this coming. That's on you." Something inside Mark snapped. The room blurred as rage took over. Without thinking, he stormed to the dresser, pulling open the top drawer. His hands grasped the cold steel of the handgun he kept for protection. As he turned back toward the bed, the weight of the gun felt heavy in his hand, like the physical embodiment of all his anger and heartbreak. "Don't move," Mark growled, his voice low and threatening. Emma gasped, her eyes widening with terror. "Mark, no. Put it down. Please." Ethan's smirk faltered for the first time. He raised his hand slowly, but his expression still carried a flicker of arrogance. "You're not going to shoot us, Mark. Be serious." But Mark's hand was steady now, his finger hovering over the trigger. The weight of betrayal, humiliation, and heartbreak had transformed him into someone he didn't recognize. His logical mind screamed at him to stop, but his emotions were in control. "You don't get to come into my house, destroy my marriage, and walk away like nothing happened," Mark spat, his voice trembling with fury. The room was electric with tension. Emma sobbed, pleading with him to put the gun down, but Mark's gaze was fixed on Ethan. He wasn't sure what he wanted: revenge, answers, or just some way to release the tidal wave of emotion that threatened to drown him. In that moment, he realized the gun wasn't just pointed at Ethan or Emma. It was pointed at everything he'd ever known, everything he thought he was. This wasn't just about them. It was about him and the pieces of his life now lying shattered on the floor. The room became a pressure cooker of emotions as Mark stood there, gun in hand, his knuckles white from gripping it so tightly. Emma was frozen, tears streaming down her face, and Ethan, for all his previous arrogance, now sat motionless, a sheen of sweat breaking out on his brow. "Mark, please," Emma choked out, her voice trembling. "This isn't you. Put the gun down. Let's talk about this." Mark's laugh was cold and bitter. "Talk? You want to talk? Now?" After this, he motioned toward the bed with the gun, his voice cracking. "What exactly do you want to talk about, Emma? How long you've been sneaking around? How I wasn't enough for you? Or how you brought him into our home, into our bed?" Ethan raised his hands higher. "Look, man, I get it. You're upset." "Upset?" Mark cut him off, his voice like thunder. "You think this is just about me being upset? You destroyed my life, my marriage, and you act like this is some joke." Ethan flinched but didn't reply. The tension in the air was suffocating. Mark's mind raced, his thoughts spiraling out of control. He wasn't a violent man, he'd always been the rational one, the guy who thought things through. But now he felt like a stranger to himself. The gun was an extension of the storm inside him, a manifestation of all the pain and anger that had built up over the years. Emma's voice broke through the haze, soft and desperate. "Mark, I'm sorry. I know I've hurt you, but this isn't the way. Please, just put it down. We can figure this out. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this." Mark's hand wavered slightly, the weight of her words tugging at the remnants of the love he still felt for her. But then his gaze fell on Ethan, who sat there like a man who thought he could escape unscathed. The thought enraged him. "This isn't just about you," Mark said, his voice calmer but no less dangerous. "This is about him too. He walked into my life and ruined it, like it was nothing." Ethan finally spoke, his tone cautious. "Look, I didn't mean for things to go this far. It just happened. But think about what you're doing, Mark. You don't want to do something you'll regret." Mark's jaw tightened. "Regret? I've been living with regret every day since I let her slip away. Since I stopped noticing what she needed." For a moment, Mark stood at a crossroads. His emotions screamed for revenge, but a small voice in the back of his mind pleaded for reason. The seconds dragged on, each one stretching the tension to its breaking point. Mark's breathing slowed as he stood there, staring down at Ethan and Emma. The weight of the moment pressed on him like a vice. Time felt suspended, as though the universe itself held its breath, waiting to see what he would do. But then, something unexpected happened. Mark's anger began to shift, not entirely fading but morphing into something else: exhaustion. The weight of betrayal, the years of love now tarnished, and the realization that no matter what he did, he couldn't undo what had already been done. It all came crashing down on him at once. His hand trembled, and the gun lowered slightly. "You know what he said," his voice hollow. "You're not worth it. Either of you." Emma let out a shaky sob, relief flooding her face, but Mark wasn't looking at her. He was staring at Ethan, who still sat frozen, clearly unsure if the danger had truly passed. Mark's eyes narrowed. "You think you've won, don't you?" he said to Ethan. "You think this is over because I'm not going to pull the trigger." He shook his head. "You're wrong. You've destroyed something that can never be fixed, and I hope you feel the weight of that every single day." He turned to Emma, his voice breaking. "And you. I loved you. I gave you everything I had, and this is how you repay me, by throwing it all away for him." Emma couldn't meet his eyes, her sobs growing louder. "Mark, don't," he interrupted, his tone icy. "I don't want to hear it. Whatever excuses you have, they don't matter anymore. You made your choice, Emma, and now I'm making mine." With that, Mark turned and walked out of the room, leaving them both behind. He still held the gun, but now it felt heavier than ever. He wasn't sure what came next, but he knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't let their betrayal define him. As he left the house, his mind raced with plans. This wasn't the end for him. It was the beginning of something new. He'd rebuild his life, stronger than before, without them. Mark stepped out of the house, the cold night air hitting him like a slap to the face. It was a stark contrast to the suffocating tension inside. He paused for a moment on the porch, his mind still reeling from everything that had just happened. The gun in his hand felt foreign now, its weight a reminder of how close he had come to crossing a line he could never uncross. His chest heaved as he drew in a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The rage was still there, bubbling under the surface, but another emotion was starting to take its place: an overwhelming sense of emptiness. The home he'd built with Emma, the life they'd shared, it was all tainted now. Mark knew he couldn't stay. Not just in the house, but in this moment, in this version of his life. He had to walk away before it consumed him. He slid the gun into the glove compartment of his car and sat behind the wheel, gripping it tightly. The silence in the car was deafening, but it gave him space to think, to process. He looked back at the house one last time. The lights glowed warmly from the inside, but to Mark, it was just a shell of what it used to be. A place that once held love and promises was now nothing more than a reminder of betrayal. As he drove away, Mark felt a mix of emotions: pain, anger, and a strange sense of liberation. For the first time in years, he realized he wasn't bound to anyone else's expectations. He was free to start over, to rebuild his life on his terms. But first, he needed to figure out how to pick up the pieces. Mark drove aimlessly for hours, the city lights blurring past him as his thoughts swirled. He replayed the scene in the bedroom over and over in his mind, the shock on Emma's face, the smirk on Ethan's. The betrayal was like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding, but beneath the pain, something else was taking root: resolve. By the time he pulled into a dimly lit diner on the edge of town, Mark had started to piece together a plan. He wasn't going to let this destroy him. No matter how much it hurt, no matter how much he'd lost, he would rebuild. He sipped on a lukewarm cup of coffee as he scrolled through his phone, searching for a lawyer. Mark wasn't one to be vindictive, but he wasn't going to let Emma walk away unscathed either. The house, the finances, the life they'd built together, it was time to divide it, and he was going to make sure it was on his terms. But it wasn't just about the legalities. Mark knew he needed to focus on himself too. The betrayal had shaken him to his core, but it had also woken him up. For too long, he'd been living on autopilot, putting everything into his work and assuming his marriage would take care of itself. Now, he realized that he needed to take care of himself. He thought about the gym membership he hadn't used in months, the friends he hadn't seen in years, the hobbies he'd abandoned. He thought about therapy, about finally addressing the parts of himself he'd ignored for so long. This was a chance to start fresh, to rebuild not just his life, but himself. As he paid his bill and walked out into the night, Mark felt a glimmer of hope for the first time since he walked into that bedroom. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing: he wasn't going to let Emma and Ethan's betrayal define him. Mark got into his car, a small, determined smile playing on his lips. This isn't the end, he said to himself. It's just the beginning. In the days that followed, Mark began taking decisive steps to sever the ties that bound him to Emma. He contacted a divorce attorney recommended by a friend, a no-nonsense professional who assured him that they'd approach the case with precision and fairness. Sitting in the lawyer's office, surrounded by legal jargon and papers to sign, Mark felt a mix of relief and sadness. This was the formal end of a chapter he never thought would close this way. The fallout wasn't just legal, it was personal too. Mutual friends and family members began to learn about what had happened. Some reached out to offer their support, while others expressed disbelief. Emma's betrayal sent ripples through their social circle, and Mark quickly realized who truly cared about him and who had been more aligned with Emma all along. Then there was Emma herself. She sent text after text, alternating between apologies, explanations, and attempts to justify her actions. She begged for a chance to meet and talk things through, but Mark ignored her messages. Her words only deepened the wound, and he knew there was no going back. What surprised Mark most was the range of emotions he cycled through. The initial anger and sadness gave way to moments of clarity and even gratitude. He realized how much of himself he'd lost in the marriage, how often he had compromised, stayed silent, or ignored his own needs for the sake of keeping the peace. At the same time, Mark struggled with loneliness. Coming home to an empty house was a stark reminder of how much his life had changed. Nights felt longer, quieter, and sometimes unbearable, but he didn't let himself sink into despair. Instead, he leaned on his small but loyal support system, talking to close friends and slowly starting to piece himself back together. The fallout wasn't easy, but it was necessary. For every painful moment, Mark reminded himself that he was moving forward, one step at a time. Months passed, and with them came a sense of renewal. Mark finalized the divorce, dividing their assets and cutting the last ties to Emma. The house, once filled with shared memories, was sold, and Mark moved into a modern, one-bedroom apartment overlooking the city. It wasn't as spacious or as luxurious as the home he once shared, but it was his. and that made all the difference. Mark threw himself into rebuilding his life. He returned to the gym, where he found solace in the rhythm of weights and cardio. He reconnected with old friends, accepting invitations to dinners, game nights, and weekend getaways that reminded him of the joys of companionship. For the first time in years, he felt like he was living for himself. He also took steps to process the emotional scars. Therapy became a weekly ritual, a place where he could untangle his feelings about the betrayal and explore the parts of himself he'd neglected during his marriage. His therapist encouraged him to focus on personal growth, to see this chapter not as a failure but as a turning point. Professionally, Mark's career flourished. Without the weight of a toxic relationship, he found himself more focused and ambitious than ever. He even began mentoring younger colleagues, finding fulfillment in helping others navigate their own paths. And then there was the unexpected meeting someone new. At a mutual friend's birthday party, Mark struck up a conversation with a woman named Claire. She was kind, funny, and refreshingly straightforward, with a smile that made him forget the pain of his past, if only for a moment. They exchanged numbers, and though Mark was cautious, he felt a spark of hope that love might find its way back into his life. As Mark reflected on the journey that brought him to this point, he felt a mix of pride and gratitude. He'd been through hell, but he had come out stronger, wiser, and more determined to live authentically. The betrayal that once threatened to destroy him had become the catalyst for his transformation. And that's Mark's story, a journey of heartbreak, betrayal, and ultimately renewal. Life can take us to the darkest places, but it's in those moments that we find the strength to rebuild. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and comment your thoughts below. Have you ever faced a betrayal that changed your life? I'd love to hear your stories. And if you want to see more gripping tales like this, make sure to subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.